If there's one thing I love about retro gaming, it's the discovery of platforms that ultimately failed to take off during their lifetime. A lot of people have rediscovered these platforms, and as a result of their scarcity, many people who want to own the systems are now finding that they cost a lot more money than they bargained for, and that includes the video games as well. It makes you wonder how on earth people can get into the hobby today when all these items cost so much money. One particular console that doesn't get talked about enough, in my opinion, is the Sega Saturn. If you haven't experienced the Sega Saturn, I recommend you do. It's a fantastic system, and after owning my Sega Saturn for about 4 or 5 years, I can definitely tell you it's jumped from being a console that I never knew anything about to one of my absolute favourites of all time. Let's talk about it. Hello and welcome back. I have to make one thing absolutely clear, unfortunately, in this video. I no longer own the Sega Saturn that I owned for about 4 or 5 years, and that was because last year I fell on hard times much like anybody else, and I had to make quick money. I had over 70 games in my collection, and I had a nice PAL Sega Saturn. The system and the games were worth quite a bit of money, so I had to make the decision to sell. I regret it every day, and I do hope one day I can get a Sega Saturn with a diskless drive, aka the SD card, and get right back into playing it, because honestly that system was truly amazing. Luckily, I made a lot of videos about the Sega Saturn, and I've still got all the footage and photos of it, so we can use that instead. The Sega Saturn then, what is it? Well, it was Sega's 5th generation attempt that they released in Japan first in 1994 before getting released everywhere else in 1995. Now, to make things perfectly clear, we all know the Sega Saturn story by now. There's been countless videos about it, many YouTubers have talked about it, so I'm not going to explain or even diverge into why the Saturn failed. Instead, I want to talk about it from my perspective as somebody who never heard of the system, never played the system, got into it, and then suddenly my interest and my experience with it exploded. How on earth did I get into the Sega Saturn? Well, back in 2010, I actually saw the system at a local Oasis shop in Birmingham, and it looked awesome. It cost £40, it was in its box, and I recognised some of the games like Sonic, and then all the other games. I just thought, what the hell is this? This was back when I was still in my PlayStation phase, where I knew nothing other than PlayStation games, and that was only the popular stuff as well. So to see a console like Sega Saturn, I had no idea that Sega actually made systems back in the day. I didn't even know they made the Mega Drive or anything else for that matter. It was a new discovery for me. Unfortunately, I was jobless at the time, and to ask my parents for £40 for a system that I knew nothing about was too risky. In 2019, so 9 years after that incident, I went into a local retro shop and I saw the same system again. This time the price was £70. However, I had a lot more experience with the system because I was watching a lot of videos back in the day that were talking about the Sega Saturn and why it was so good and underrated. And I got interested. I thought, it can't be that bad, right? It looks cool. And so on that day, because I had a job at that time, I decided to pony up the £70 and I bought the system. The gentlemen who were in there gave me 3 different games to play. They were Die Hard Trilogy, a game that I knew very well. I got to play Manx TT Superbike, which I had no idea was an arcade port. And I also got to play Fighting Vipers, which turned out to be one of my favourite games during the time that I owned the Sega Saturn. And I had no idea that Sega made a fighting game other than Virtua Fighter. So it was a learning curve for me. Unfortunately, that Saturn wasn't working so hot, so I had to go and get it fixed sometime later. At the time, Sega Saturn games, especially those in PAL regions, were fairly cheap, and I was on the hunt to get more games. After all, 3 games is nowhere near enough in my opinion, and I really wanted to experience the system. So I got on eBay, and throughout 2019 and 2022, I bought all sorts of games for the system. You'll see them on screen now as I play them, but honestly, I was just hooked. I couldn't believe how amazing the system was, in my opinion. But at the same time, I saw why the Saturn was also considered to be a system that was hard to program for. A lot of games that I was playing, mostly ports of popular games that I played on PlayStation already, were not in the best of shape. Some of them were quite good, mind you. Resident Evil comes to mind. That was a great port. It didn't look as good as the PlayStation version, but it performed well enough, and I thought it was a nice port. It was just a good port. The team behind that port did it justice. But then you get to things like Destruction Derby. That was a horrible port. I hated that one. You know, it's not just the graphics or the frame rate, just the whole game played poorly, and it is definitely a game I don't recommend on Sega Saturn. But the one thing about Saturn that I loved was the fighting games. Its controller, that 6 joypad button controller, was superb. It felt nice in the hands, the D-pad was solid, the buttons felt solid, the triggers felt good, it all just felt nice in your hand. And I always remembered looking forward to playing with that control pad because it was just so nice to use. 2D games, fighting games were an absolute joy on the Sega Saturn. Playing Darkstalkers on there, playing Street Fighter, and all the other hosts of fighting games like Virtua Fighter, Fighting Vipers, Rabbit. There was all kind of games that I was playing on the Sega Saturn. I got so invested into the system that I learned about the action replay card and that the Japanese market was really the ideal place to get your favourite Sega Saturn games. It was also how I managed to get a couple of games cheaper because the import market, the Japanese market, when it came to the UK anyway, was cheaper than the PAL or NTSC equivalent. So you can imagine that when I realised this, and of course most of its best games were Japanese exclusive, I jumped onto that bandwagon, and thanks to the Action Replay cartridge, it not only acted as a 1MB or 4MB RAM expansion cartridge extension for the Sega Saturn, which made a lot of its best games playable on my PAL system. More importantly, it provided as a region lock bypass. So in other words, I didn't have to go and get a Japanese system to play Japanese games. I could use my PAL system, use the Action Replay, bypass the region lock, and boom. The only downside about that was you had to get a region switch, 650 to 60 Hz switch, otherwise the games in the Japanese region or NTSC region would play too slowly. This didn't necessarily make every game unplayable, but you could tell the speed difference if you knew what you were looking for. In 2023, I upgraded to a Japanese model, and I also got the Satiator, which is a little card that goes into where the video CD slot would be, and it acts as not only as a bypass, but you could use SD cards to play your Sega Saturn games. So in other words, you could keep the CD drive, but you could also use the SD card slot, and let me tell you, that transformed my Sega Saturn experience. Yes, at that point I had 80 games to play, physically, but to play anything I wanted on the Japanese system in the correct speed, along with playing with all the different hacks and homebrew that are coming out on the Sega Saturn right now, it was a dream come true. Unfortunately, that little card wasn't cheap, it was £300, so if you want to get into that area of Sega Saturn, be warned, it is not cheap. The one thing that people kept saying to me about the Sega Saturn was that its architecture was well built for 2D games, and they're absolutely right. Not only were the 2D games better suited for the architecture and worked better than most PlayStation versions, but also if you include the 1MB and 4MB RAM expansion cartridge games, the Sega Saturn was a beast when it was used in the right hands. This was the problem though. In the Western world, it wasn't used in the right hands. Most companies tried to port over the 3D games that were first featured on PlayStation and PC, and the advanced architecture meant that unfortunately a lot of the ports were substandard at best. There were very few ports from the Western world that were successful or even comparable to the PlayStation. And in the Western eyes, that meant that people believed that the Sega Saturn was weaker than it truly was. This affected sales in the Western world, but while the Western region were affected by all the press and all the negative reactions surrounding the Sega Saturn and its bad butchered ports, the Japanese market, on the other hand, was a different story. Using Virtua Fighter, for example, that game was blowing up in Japan, and because Sega were the only ones porting it to their systems, it gave the Saturn a head start in that region. And of course, the deluge of fighting games, RPGs, 2D games, all the best stuff came to the Sega Saturn in Japan. That's what helped it to keep going in that region. But here, most of the games we got were bad ports, and when good ports of games did come over, it was far too late. Overall then folks, if you're going to get into the Sega Saturn today, what should you do, what should you look out for, and how should you go about things? The Sega Saturn and its games have increased in price dramatically since I first got into the platform myself. That means getting cheap deals on Japanese games are no longer a viable option, and it also means that collecting for the Saturn is difficult. I always recommend trying to get the Japanese model if you can. It's the cheapest way to go, and if you get all the little extras like the Action Replay cartridge, it will save you a ton of money on region lockouts. Also, I do recommend dabbling in emulation first to see if you'll like the games in question before going and buying the real thing. And of course, you can buy new mods like the Satiator that I talked about earlier. You can buy the optical CD drive-less consoles, so you can use SD cards only. And of course, the Action Replay is great if you still want to get a physical collection in your library without having to go and buy separate systems to get all the region of games working correctly on your system. When it comes to video output, most systems will come with composite, but I recommend you go with S-Video, RGB, or if you have a component solution, use component cables and they will work. But keep in mind, the Sega Saturn used 240p, 288p, or 576i, or 480i for its games, so make sure if you're playing on a CRT or an upscaler or a HD TV, make sure that all these resolutions will work on your display before you go and pull the trigger. On a CRT, no problem. On a modern display, well, if it has no analog ports, make sure you get an upscaler that will upscale to at least 480p or 576p, or can deinterlace the footage from 480i to 480p or 576i to 576p. There's a lot of third-party cables out there nowadays, so they're going to be the cheaper way to go if you want to get good video for your Sega Saturn. Getting the official Sega Saturn cables will be very expensive and costly, so I personally used a component cable from Retro Gaming Cables that was third party, very high quality, cost me £50 and it was great. You can go even cheaper and get a RGB SCART cable for about £30 and it will give you the same quality, excellent quality that is, and SCART in the United Kingdom is a more common connector type for retro gaming, so I would recommend you go with that and it will save you a lot of money and hassle. I had a great 4 years with the system. I do regret selling it, but at the time I had to do it, and I hope one day I can rebuy the system using an SD card mod, and I will get back into making not only Sega Saturn content, but more importantly, getting back into the Sega Saturn library in general, because there were so many great games that we didn't get in the Western world. We're getting a lot of English translation mods and hacks and homebrews, and recently I started seeing a arcade game being ported by homebrew by a person. It's called X-Men 92. So if we can get more ports like this, maybe, just maybe, all those arcade ports that we always wanted to see on Sega Saturn will finally come true. Yes, I'm looking at you, Golden Axe Revenge of Death Adder. I want to see that on Sega Saturn legit. And if this actually happens, I will be over the moon. I want to play that game on Sega Saturn. And that concludes my Sega Saturn experience after 4 years of owning the system from 2019 to 2023. What do you folks think of the Sega Saturn? Have you ever owned one? Do you want to own one? Do you want to play the games? Have you ever dabbled in emulation? Let me know in the comments. Let me know what your favourite game is for the Sega Saturn, and I will see you next time.